Hello, everybody, and welcome. So nice to see people here and have you here. If I look to my side, it's just where I can see any comments. So if you have comments, be sure to make them in LinkedIn. Today, we're talking about the hidden exhaustion of low trust and how teams get really tired long before they fall apart. So, a lot of leaders right now are talking about burnout and change fatigue. I'm sure you've heard of it, right? Or even said it yourself. And those things are real. But I think there's something underneath a lot of what we don't talk about enough. And I think a lot of teams are exhausted from managing uncertainty all day long. By the way, if we haven't met yet, my name is Marcy Fortnow, and I'm with Engaging Play. And I work with leaders and teams around communication and collaboration and trust. And honestly, this pattern of exhaustion is showing up everywhere right now because low trust doesn't just create conflict, it creates emotional labor. And emotional labor, it's draining. I was talking with a client recently who kept saying, people seem tired, morale feels low, everyone's overwhelmed. But when we started unpacking what was actually happening, it wasn't only the amount of work. What was actually exhausting people just wasn't the workload. It was things like people second guessing decisions, rewriting emails 3 times before sending, trying to predict reactions before speaking, people carefully managing their optics instead of just doing the work. I've also seen the occurrence of meetings after the meeting. You know, the meeting ends and then suddenly the Slack lights up, or there are people that hang out after, and that's where the real conversation happens. Maybe it's in the hallway or in the parking lot. They're checking reality, they're checking their understanding and comparing confidence levels, all of which is inefficient and also has them creating stories that may or may not be true. And that kind of environment, it burns enormous energy. I call it a trust tax. Low trust turns normal work into emotional labor. I remember talking to someone who told me they spent more time trying to manage perception than actually moving their work forward. And that really struck me because this was a smart, capable, experienced professional. And instead of focusing on solving problems, they were focused on, how do I word this? Who should I CC? Should I wait until tomorrow to send this? Maybe this isn't a good time. And imagine doing that 10 times a day. When enough people on a team start operating that way, exhaustion becomes part of the culture. And the tricky part is leaders don't immediately see that emotional labor because symptoms like that don't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like people over explaining everything just to protect themselves, adding extra context and documenting every little thing, making sure they can prove they covered themselves later if needed. Or you might start noticing communication getting really cautious. I talked to someone recently who told me they had drafted the same email 4 different times because they were trying to predict how leadership would react. Not because the email was wrong, but because they were trying to avoid the emotional fallout. Another thing that happens is decision making can slow way down. I was speaking with someone yesterday who said their supervisor had become such a bottleneck that people had almost stopped moving forward without explicit approval because nobody wanted to make the wrong call. And then there's meetings where everybody agrees a little too quickly, right? No real debate, no healthy pushback, people sort of waiting to see where leadership lands before they say what they actually think. And none of those things feel catastrophic on their own in the moment, but together they create constant vigilance. And vigilance is exhausting. One of the biggest signs of this trust tax I see is when people start adapting themselves to leadership moods instead of adapting to the actual work. And what's really interesting and hard is that teams start spending their energy monitoring everybody and leadership's emotional state. Are they calm? Are they stressed, reactive, distracted? And what happens is people delay decisions and they keep drafts of their work close until they see what version of leadership is showing up that day. And when teams start spending more energy reading the room than doing the work, exhaustion builds up fast. You can almost hear the internal calculations people are making all day long. Like, is it safe for me to say this or to raise this point? Will this change again? How careful do I need to be? And none of that energy is going toward the actual work. It's going towards self protection. The internal processing takes energy and a lot of it. And I actually think this connects directly to what many organizational leaders are calling change fatigue right now. Because I think change itself is usually, well, I don't think that change itself is usually the real problem. I think that teams can absolutely handle change. People are resilient, teams are adaptable. People have successfully made huge changes and risen to the challenge and done more than survive. But change becomes exhausting when trust is low. Without trust, every organizational shift starts to feel like adaptation and less like adaptation and more like threat assessment. Instead of focusing on the work itself, people start trying to read the environment around the work. They start wondering, are we really changing direction again? Do they actually honestly want feedback here or just agreement? How careful do I need to be with this? What happens if this blows up or goes sideways? Or sometimes it's as simple as, should I even start this yet? Or priority is going to change again by Thursday. And when people spend that much energy as trying to assess risk, predict reactions, and protect themselves, it is exhausting. That's what drains people, not just the work itself, not even the change itself. The emotional effort of constantly managing risk and uncertainty. And this is important because many leaders respond to exhaustion by trying to reduce the workload alone. And just to be clear, I mean, sometimes workload really is the issue, but sometimes the more powerful and impressive leadership lever is reducing unnecessary emotional friction, reducing that trust tax. So, what can leaders actually do? Well, there are three big things you can actually do. The first is increase clarity. People can handle hard truths better than confusing ones. When priorities constantly shift and decisions feel mysterious, when expectations are implied instead of stated, people burn energy trying to interpret the environment. Clarity reduces stress. Second, create consistency. Trust isn't built through inspirational speeches, it's built through predictability. Can people rely on your reactions? Do expectations stay relatively stable? Do behaviors match words? Because inconsistency creates guardedness and constant monitoring, and that kind of vigilance creates exhaustion. And third, make it safer to be honest. If people can't ask questions or disagree respectfully, admit mistakes, or raise concerns without fear of punishment or embarrassment, they stay armored and in defensive mode all day long. And armored people do not collaborate well, they do not innovate well, and eventually they get tired. Exhausted teams don't always need less work. Sometimes they need less uncertainty, less self protection, less energy spent managing risk instead of doing meaningful work. So here's the question I'd like to leave you with today. Where might your team be spending emotional energy protecting themselves instead of collaborating, contributing, and moving work forward? Because that's often where trust work begins. And the tricky part is leaders inside the system don't always see these patterns clearly. They just feel the symptoms like slower decisions or hesitation or exhaustion, tension, disengagement. And those symptoms, they're telling you something. Maybe what they're telling you is this: your team may not be resisting the work, they may be protecting themselves from the environment around the work. If this conversation resonated with you and you're seeing these dynamics in your own team, let's talk. This is exactly the kind of work I help leaders and teams navigate together, creating conditions for more trust, healthier communication, stronger collaboration, and better performance without burning people out in the process. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that you gain some wisdom, and I will see you next time. Please reach out if there's anything I can do to support you. Thanks so much. Bye bye.